Hello! In this presentation, I'm going to give an overview of some recent projects of ours where we try to extract personality information from narratives. The main challenge for us that we try and address is finding ways of how we can study personality information processes dynamics across time and space. As we can't interview people that lived 100 or 1,000 years ago, we have to rely on other information. Our entry point to this is the lexical hypothesis, first proposed by Francis Galton. After leafing through some dictionaries, he suggested it is possible to extract what we now call personality information from individual words that encode important information about habitual patterns of behavior, thought, and emotion. And so, therefore, by looking at the terms that people use to describe each other, we should be able to get some idea of relevant personality information. And obviously, then starting with the work by Cattell and others, using factor analysis, we can identify potential underlying dimensions that can be used to describe the important features of personality. What people have done in the past when focusing on ancient text is, for example, using existing personality dictionaries or classification schemes and coding the adjectives that were used, for example, by Homer to describe characters in his Iliad, to classify and code them into modern day personality trait theories. So, for example, Pasakos and Dirac analysis showing that agreeableness and conscientiousness were relatively frequent in the descriptions of characters in the Iliad. A different approach is, for example, used by Johnson and colleagues, where they ask readers, so modern day readers, to rate the characters in different novels. So again, we use modern day classifications, dictionaries, uh, trait definitions to understand and describe characters in novels over historical time periods. What we are interested in is really the meaning of or the underlying implicit personality structures that authors may have had in their mind when they wrote their texts. So rather than using a top down approach where we presume that personality dimensions as we use them today are valid and applicable to these ancient texts, we use a bottom up approach where we use the information embodied or encoded in the individual words and their co occurrences when describing characters in order to extract possible underlying structures. So for doing that, we use an approach that Marcus has developed, which is a transcendental information cascade, which is essentially a network approach to that captures objects over time and assigns relevant information, gives relevant information tokens to these objects, and they can be traced over time. And this allows us to extract both co-occurrence matrices as well as recurrence matrices to capture both the structure and the changes over time. So far, we haven't actually, in our approach with personality work, we haven't really fully used all the possibilities of that approach and have primarily focused on the co-occurrence information. I will explain a little bit more of how we do that in a second. So I will briefly explain two studies, one published on Dickens and Austen already, and another one that where we have a preprint where we focus on the Gilgamesh epic. For the analysis of Dickens and Austen, or like in general, when using these transcendental information cascade approaches, we can focus on character level analyses. So what kind of terms are used to describe characters? We can do analyses at a level of books, so what terms co-occur within the same book, or we can also look at the whole corpus across a number of different books. So for the study of Dickens and Austen, we actually focused on the characters. So how does that work? We run some classic computational methods on the literature first. And so what it does, it extracts a character and then finds all the descriptors of that character and maps them to each other. And so, for example, Pip being described as Christian and soon after Pip described as explicit allows us to map explicit and Christian in relation to Pip together. And so by extracting a co-occurrence matrix per or across all these characters, we can then treat characters as if they were participants in a typical psychology study and run a factor analysis on the co-occurrence matrix. And by doing that, we can identify common factors that may have guided the authors when writing their character descriptions. The interesting part is we can now map these factor structures onto modern day self-rating solutions. And the first thing we can see, both for Austen or Dickens, across different number of factors being extracted, the similarity after procrustion rotation is rather low, which suggests that modern day dictionary based factor structures do not map onto the implicit factor structures that Austen and Dickens used when describing their characters. At the same time, though, the similarities are much higher than what we would expect just based on, for example, random factor structures. Furthermore, what is really interesting for us, we can qualitatively identify meaningful factors. So for both for the character descriptions for Dickens as well as for Austen, and looking at these factors that qualitatively seem to make sense, we can identify factors that seem to be similar across Austen and Dickens. But then once we start running some more quantitative tests on it, we can't really find factors that quantitatively are similar across the two authors. Um, and another interesting part is some of these effects, even though none of them have high reach modern thresholds that we would use to say, like they're identical, there seem to be some interesting dictionary effects as well. At the same time, though, by looking at the most frequent terms that either author is using, we can identify nuances in the personality descriptions by both authors. And in the paper, if you're interested, we go a little bit into possible explanations for this based on contemporary literary theory and also sociological theories about the backgrounds when these authors were writing for what kind of audiences. And so I think it actually offers a really interesting opportunity for more kind of idiosyncratic personality descriptions and analyses. So now shifting gear, let's move back about 4,000 years and focusing on the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is a king, or we presume it was actually a person that lived about 2800 BC in the city of Uruk, and most likely was a king of that city. About 500, 600 years later, the first written records of these exploits of Gilgamesh appeared, still in southern Mesopotamia, which is southern Iraq today. But the most complete version of the standard Babylonian version, which is the classic version of the Gilgamesh story, are available from the royal library of the Assyrian king Assur-banipal, in modern day Nineveh in northern Iraq. So just to give you a bit of an overview of the versions that are available and the time spans. So the first texts that we have reach back about 2100 BC. They are written in Sumerian. They are they're independent poems about the exploits of Gilgamesh and all the kind of stuff that he got up to. They're relatively well preserved. But they're independent stories. And about 200 years later, in Akkadian, so in a different language, we have a first kind of coherent narrative that links these stories into an integrated epic. And some of the scholars in the humanities actually say the major shift has been happening at the Old Babylonian um, text stage, where like as these dynasties, the first Babylonian dynasty emerged, some major shift happened, and these stories were integrated into some coherent epic. The Middle Babylonian text, there are some further changes. Unfortunately, they're very fragmented, and we had to discard them for most of our analyses. And then the Standard Babylonian text, which historically uh, has captured most of the excitement and interest, is a set of 12 tablets. So that's a standardized epic that is relatively coherent and has been very well preserved. Has been found across a lot of different archaeological sites, but the most complete version is really from that library in Nineveh. And so the interesting part here is we have a story that circulates in writing for about 2000 years uh, during a period when major shifts happened in increasing complexity, increasing complexity of institutions, integration and emergence of huge empires. So, which provides a really interesting snapshot into a period that is really crucial for the understanding of human evolution, and potentially can give us some insights into what kind of personality dimensions these authors, these scripts, these orators had when they integrated or wrote those stories. And so these tablets are really fascinating. But as you can see, like clay tablets, they're also very brittle. And so one of the major challenges is that we have a lot of fragments that are often incomplete. So we worked with the English translations by Andrew George. He has the most complete or authoritative translations of the epic at the moment for the tablets from the different periods. But even here, like it's a poem structure, um, lots of fragments. We were not able to use computational tools all the way the same way we did for the other project. So what we had to do is we had to use some kind of combination of both human coders and computational tools. So what we did is we used the English translations by um, Andrew George for the different time periods. We ran some computational analyses where we extracted um, the part of where we did a part of speech tagging, which allows us to uh, relatively easily identify adjectives and verbs. Then a human coder, Amy, basically went through the whole text and assigned relevant adjectives and verbs to characters. We then mapped the relevant adjectives and verbs to contemporary psychological dictionaries. So we used a number of different dictionaries, and then we computed term frequencies and term co-occurrence matrices across these characters, did some structural analyses, and compared them over time. And another thing, just as a side note, we also did some translation checks. And one of the challenges using a translation is that we often are not sure whether actually the captured meaning is the same in the original texts. So, but using at least the Akkadian versions, and seeing what kind of words have been translated or how they have been translated into English, at least there is high consistency in the translation. So the first thing, just looking at the frequency of terms, are the same terms being used over time. And what we see is greater similarity in word frequency across temporarily closer periods. So Sumerian and Old Babylonian, which on average differ about 200 years. The frequency, the correlation of frequencies is 0.72, whereas for Old Babylonian and Standard Babylonian, which on average are like 400 years of difference, but sharing the same language, is a correlation of 0.4, whereas the most distant, so the closest overlap is about 600 years. We have a correlation of 0.49. When trying to match adjectives and verbs to contemporary dictionaries, what we see is over time there are more adjectives that can be mapped onto more modern dictionaries. So more terms are being used that map onto the modern dictionaries that we use in psychological analyses. At the same time, the number of trait factors that can be identified, here, for example, we focused on the 10 most common characters across all the different versions. And what we can see is over time, we have an increasing number of trait factors that are apparent. So if you think about it in terms of, for example, the big five, over time, more of the big five seem to be emerging and being used for the description of the characters. But at the same time, what we really want to see is the meaning structures that emerge or that are implicit in these narratives. And here is, for example, just the bootstrapped multidimensional scaling models. And what would be or what we thought would be the most interesting information right now is trying to see how similar are these structures after rotation. So the terms using the terms that are common across the different periods and then comparing the structures relative to each other. And so what we find again is temporarily closer structures. So Sumerian and Old Babylonians. Here I basically stacked the similarity of the correlations for dimension 1 and 2 together. So what you can see overall, the temporarily closer dimensions are more similar and the temporarily more distant structures are more dissimilar. So Sumerian and Standard Babylonian are least similar to each other. At the same time, though, if we can if we look at the negative and positive poles, so what adjectives are located at the negative and positive poles for the two dimensions across the different time periods, what is really interesting, working with people who are archaeologists who work with this material, we can identify dimensions that do make sense from the historical periods, but they do not nicely match onto our modern day um, personality structures. So, in summary, um, we believe that the analysis of personality descriptors that are available in narratives offer really unique opportunities to analyze personality dimensions across time and space. In particular, the transcendental information cascade approach, I think, has a lot of potential. Um, Unfortunately, we have not been able to really fully use the potential of this method, partially because the incomplete data structure, for example, for the Gilgamesh epic. On the other hand, also because we first have to look at the just the structures themselves, because before we can look at some of these more complex temporal changes that can be used or that can be analyzed with this tick approach. Um, at the same time, though, if you think about the Big Five, for example, there are challenges for the Big Five as kind of for the assumption that there is a relatively stable structure that is independent of time or space. At the same time, though, I think these findings, in particular the findings for uh, the Gilgamesh story are consistent with recent niche construction theories of personality, which assume that what is conveyed within, for example, narratives needs to fit in the specific institutional, social, economic context, right? So, and this is also consistent with the kind of shifts that we see towards more contemporary trade structures with increasing institutional complexity over the 2000-year period that this epic was in circulation. And so, in a way, it really points towards a revised lexical hypothesis, which I would suggest is varies along the ways of like the lexical hypothesis is really about conveying relevant information in contextually relevant information clusters. So there is information in these terms that can be analyzed, but what we have to look at is what kind of combinations of terms are locally meaningful within the specific context. So that's all for today. I really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts. Would be great to have a discussion. Unfortunately, it's not in person. If you're interested in particular in the Gilgamesh story, here's the preprint. And if you have some comments or thoughts, reach out to me. It would be lovely to talk to you and discuss ideas with you.